Today I would like to reflect with you about the social aspects which were behind the rise of the ecclesiastical institutions until their transformation in stable offices with a structured hierarchy. In particular, I will focus on the secular ones, the dioceses and the chapters. What do social aspects mean? They are the relationships, formal or informal, that shape the social space of the Christian community. According to the recent sociological reflections, a social space is a physical or a virtual space where people gather and interact. In the case of the Christian religion, we can consider as related social space the physical buildings where the faithful meet, for example, the churches, or the virtual community which they are part of, the idea of the flock of Christ. How Henry Lefebvre maintained in 2009, the social space, the space is social, a social construction. And now I'm quoting Lefebvre. It involves assigning appropriated places to social relations, and it has thus always been a social product. It means that all the human communities rethink the physical space in order to adapt it according to their own needs or deeds. What is more important, however, is the fact that the human communities can change in depth the ambience they have been getting in touch over time. This is the main problem we are coping with nowadays. Our presence on the earth as a human community has been radically modifying the entire ecosystem because of our mental paradigm of a relationship between the human being and the earth. But this is not the matter of my speech. So now, moving back to the medieval Europe, an immediate example of this process is offered by the Christianization of the urban space between the 4th and 6th century all around the Mediterranean regions. The conversion to the Christian faith of the most of the urban inhabitants resulted in the creation of a new, even larger buildings for the public cult, especially after the Theodosius decree in 380. In that period, basilica became a synonym of religious place due to the adoption by the Christians of the basilica's model for their temples. Another important invention is the cemetery, or the so-called saints' yard. Collocated underground during the early 3 centuries of the Christian history, well known is the case of the catacomb. The cemeteries assumed over the 4th century another important and conformation and collocation surface, especially on the edge of the urban walls. But more than the physical aspect, today I would like to trace a path on the virtual aspect of the Christian social space. The Christian faithful, in fact, consider themselves like a flock which follows Christ's shepherd on the path to the salvation. The Ecclesia, the Christian community, is thus an immaterial space of sociality, because all its members are owed to the reciprocal aid and assistance in material needs and spiritual care. Even when the material social spaces lack, the church exists thanks to the community, how Christ himself ensures his apostles in Matthew 18:12. Community, though, needs an order. The intense relationships that gathered the faithful did not cover all the needs they had in terms of pastoral care, communication with the other communities, solution of contrasts and problems. The solution was the creation of a group within the community with specific duties, the presbyteroi, the antecedents of the actual priests. They were led by an episcopos who was the referent for the whole community. His figure was bestowed through many peculiar duties typical of the apostles' prerogatives. He was the only one who might baptize on Easter night, choose and consecrate the performers of the liturgical services, rule on the religious life of the community. We can consider this structure, people, clerics, bishop, like the basilar organization of the Christian communities, the dioceses. The number of priests varied over the time. The larger, obviously, the community was, the bigger the number of clergymen active was. The number of bishops, on the contrary, remained stable at one for each community. The reasons are two. On one side, a collegiate comported discussions and fights, whilst a monocratic authority guaranteed, or should have guaranteed, the unity and the peace. On the other side, the bishop's role was spiritually linked to the apostolic heritage, because a bishop acted as a shepherd of his flock. In some way, the apostles did it for the early communities. It is in this charismatic conception of the episcopal role that we can find the roots of its fortune. The idea of the apostolic succession. A very well-known application of it is the papal primacy, based on the idea that the bishops of Rome have been the successors of the Apostle Peter. Over the time to the liturgical service that justified the rise of particular figures inside the communities, were added other functions. The shepherds, in fact, became the referent for the political, social, economical matters related to his community, especially during and after the collapse of the Roman Empire in the Western Europe regions. The role of the bishops changed in depth. In front of the crisis of the political authorities, the bishops were assuming social functions necessary for their communities. An example is that of the anonymous bishop of Bazar in Gallia, described in the book The Glory of the Martyrs by Gregory of Tours. The little city, like you can, how you can see in the slide, the little city was besieged in 414 by Goths and Alans. In the episode, the only authority mentioned was that of the bishop, who prayed God and requested the liberation of the city. The divine intervention defends and saves the city. Gregory of Tours obviously is a biased witness, and his narration is partial, but it is symptomatic of the dominant sentiment of the role of the bishops inside his community in front of the tragic events of the German invasions and the disappearance of the Roman Empire. This slow and constant mutation influenced the form of the Christian life and the organization of the cult. The Christian dominant space was that of the cities, where the clerics and the bishops lived and performed. Outside the urban walls, the paganism or the apotropic religion was absolutely prevalent. This weakness of the church is doubled by two social aspects. On the one hand, the personal affiliation to the Christian communities. On the other hand, the system of election of the bishops. What is the personal affiliation? Every Christian faithful was free to choose the community to belong and attend to for his or her own sacramental life. In opposition to the territorial districts which composed the Roman Empire, the Christian organization founded on the sacramental criterion. Cinzio Violante named this way of organization principle of God's people, because according to this principle, what was constituting the Christian community was not the territory where they stayed or lived, but the people of God who followed their shepherd, the bishop. The first example of this principle is given in two letters by Pope Gelasius I in the last years of the 5th century. The Bishop of Rome sent an anonymous bishop to meet two fighting brothers for solving their contrasts about the jurisdiction of some vici that were tiny agricultural centers. In his letters, Gelasius declared that the principle for the division should not be the limites or the territorium, but the sacramental participation. The authority of a bishop reached all the faithful who had received the baptism, the confirmation, and the priestly consecration by him. This is the principle of the personal relationship between the chief and the people, made up of clerics and laymen. This aspect emerged, in particular, in occasion of fights for determining the jurisdiction on the landscape communities. An example was that of the conflict between the Bishop of Siena and that of Arezzo in 18th century. The reason behind this conflict is the control of 20 baptisteria, little churches provided with a baptistery and where the priests had the right of performing the baptism. These churches were collocated in an area traditionally under the jurisdiction of the Bishop of Arezzo, but geographically near Siena. Around 650, a first arbitrate established that these churches were under the jurisdiction of the Bishop of Arezzo because all the priests had consecrated and installed there by him or his predecessors, following the principle of the personal tie. However, further violence from both the parties, from Siena and Arezzo, resumed the conflict. In 711, the Lombard king Liutprand commissioned his Magister Palazzi Ambrosius to hear both the parties again and to judge on conflict. In August 714, Ambrosius issued a sentence in favor of Arezzo. The opponents recalled the king appeal, but even that time they lost the judgment. The reason is clear and simple. The Bishop of Siena maintained his right according to the principle that the baptisteria stand on the ancient territory of the Siena city. On the contrary, the Bishop of Arezzo defended his rights on the basis of the personal and sacramental relationship he had with the local priests. This principle was so prevalent that in the scheme of questions for the witnesses, the matter was not where the churches stand, but who consecrated the churches or the priests. In the light of our discourse on the social space, we can see in this personal principle the first step of the path to the modern institutions. After the collapse of the Roman Empire and the dissolution of its administrative geography, the local churches reorganized the presence in the city and then in landscape on the basis of the only ensured form of connection, the personal and sacramental relationship. In this confirmation, all the ties of authority moved from and went back to the bishop. There were neither stable offices nor fixed administrative praxis. For this reason, we can define this diocesan organization like the social space of the bishop, because the whole diocese existed only because of the personal connections which the bishops held and guaranteed. The second aspect was that of the elective nature of the Episcopal Church. Since its origins, the Christian communities had a charismatic guide. The method of its selection used to be the election. All the faithful met and indicated their candidate. The system of the election was considered the most complied with the idea of the divine inspiration in the selection, idea that is still alive nowadays. In any case, this system has many defects. The most dangerous is the human ambition. The electors can be corrupted in many ways, and in some way the divine inspiration directs by a specific to a specific candidate. After the Christianization of the Roman society and the rise of the German kingdoms, the Episcopal Church remained as one of the few offices the Roman aristocratic or richest families had for the career of their members. A very well-known example of this new approach is Aurelio Ambrogio, Archbishop of Milan during last quarter of the 4th century. He was a member of a Roman family which expressed the imperial officers, and Ambrogio himself served the empire as a governor of the Italian area, the northern part of Italy. And in 374 was elected bishop by the people of Milan, where he was holding the chair of a governor, had a conspicuous retinue, and had strict contacts with the imperial court and the urban nobility. These elements enhanced the suspect that his election was more or less directed by the imperial court in agreement with the local aristocracy. This case reveals which interests can move around the episcopal election. The prevalent interests were those of the local aristocracy. In some cases, the Episcopal Church became patrimony of a few families. The most relevant case was that of Rome, where the ancient senatorial families fought with rude violence for controlling the episcopal chair. In other cases, the same family held, in the same time, political and religious churches. An interesting case comes from Kapwa, a little urban center in the Lombard southern Italy. The history began when, in 843, Landolfo became a Gastald of Kapwa. The Gastald is a sort of a public judge with a jurisdiction on some urban centuries. Landolfo had 6 sons. One of them, Landolfo Junior, was elected Bishop of Kapwa, while Landolfo Senior was alive. It is almost sure that this election was sponsored or perhaps paid by his father. But the story changed completely after Landolfo Senior died, how you can read in the text on the slide. In fact, his son started a fraternal fight which teared and consumed their control on the city and on the relative county. One of the protagonists was Landolfo Junior himself, who fought free of all constraints against his brothers and kinship until they left the town in exile. In 863, he gathered the political and the religious powers together and dominated the city and the county for more than 15 years. In Kapwa's case, the social space of the diocese was completely fragmented and confused. The bishop, who should rule on and through his relationship, spent most of his time to fight for lay reasons. The confusion of roles and interests between the clerical part and the lay part of the Christian community frequently resulted in a progressive detriment of the pastoral care and in the disarticulation of the social space. How maintained above, the bishop was the referring point of this space. If the shepherd focuses on other very material matters rather than cares the faithful's needs, the community loses its centers. In front of a weakened episcopal role, other actors emerged. On the one hand, the urban clergy, on the other hand, the monasticism. I do not speak about the second because it leads us out of the path I have indicated for today. For what concerns the urban clergy, it was considered the bishop's clergy because the towns or the cities used to have only the cathedral or other mother church as building for the liturgical service. The other churches were more like places for praying or participating once in the year, the misses. All the clerks were appointed by the bishop or under his authority performed the various religious deeds. The attention for their lives and their conduct emerged urgently already in the Carolingian period, when Emperor Louis the Pious in 816 adopted the decree of Chrodegang of Metz about the common life for the secular clerks and imposed it as the lifestyle for the whole Frankish territory. The decree consisted of 34 canons. They introduced the common life for the secular clerks, the adoption of the monastic votes, and some rules for dividing the incomes. The distinctive sign of the clerics were the tonsure and the dress. In this religious form, we can recognize the start point of the secular chapters. The secular clerks, in fact, was obliged to live in a sort of monastic way. The only difference was the collocation, because the monks avoided the urban areas. Meanwhile, the seculars performed their religious deeds in the urban context. The common life was, for secular clerks, a twofold precious training for the autonomy. The common life creates a sense of membership, the first step for constituting a separated group. Secondly, it favors stable relationships between the members. The collegiate were a sort of breeding ground. They were clerics from every social classes who lived all together, learned and prayed in a reciprocal education, but remained different in terms of career. Only the members of the richest urban families could reach ambitious changes like that of the librarian, bibliothecarius, the chanter, the cantor, the reader, lector, the deacon, the diaconus. The stability of the aristocratic families present and the definition of the liturgical offices resulted over the time in the stabilization of the collegiates and the duties of this kind of ecclesiastical organ in the urban life and then in the diocesan life. A figuration of their role or life was drawn in the exultet roles. They are liturgical roles used usually in Easter night for announcing Christ's resurrection. Since the 10th century, these roles were decorated and illuminated. Very large is the presence of the cathedral's clergy, like you can see on the image, with different vestments and colors for distinguishing the various roles and charges they held. The massive presence in these scenes was significant. They were the priestly corpus of the church with the bishop and around the bishop. Through them, we are in front of the plastic, visible configuration of the new idea of the Christian social space. The ancient hierarchy, people, clerks, bishop, splits in two different bodies, the laymen and the ecclesiastics. It is the spirit of the reform, the so-called Gregorian reform. The ecclesiology of the church as a unique body and community was re-elaborated. The term church became a synonym of ecclesiastical hierarchy. The lay body had to be subjected to the clerics and separated by them. It is obvious that this fracture was actually impossible. Men and women, in fact, even after the consecration, stand as part of their social and personal networks. For example, the members of the collegiates did not suddenly lose and cancel their parental friendly relationships. On the contrary, they acted as vectors for their original clans. Through them, in fact, the aristocracy, or more in general, the upper class, finds another way to reach and gain a prestigious position, a fixed income, and an influence role in the ecclesiastical hierarchy for one or more of their members. This means that this spiritual space assumed the role of mediation and connection between the richest and the powerful group of the urban upper class and the chief of the diocesan community. They were a sort of peculiar mixture between the two bodies of the church, where the interests and conflicts found reciprocal and inevitable place for speaking each other and finding a solution in occasion of contrasts. The stable chapters, like the cathedral ones, are the last and structured confirmation of the collegiates. The most important innovations and differences are two: the division of the common incomes, the so-called massa communis in prebends, the division in prebends, and the reconsideration of these special clerics, the canons, inside the scaffold of the diocesan government. This growing structuration of the secular collegiate was directly due to the reconstructing process, which involved the communities around 10th and 11th centuries. The late antiquity diocese, in fact, had been mostly city-centered communities. Once the system of personal ties showed its limits, the clergymen sought new forms of organization. In particular, the principle of territoriality turned back as a possible recover. Instead of the voluntary participation and the sacramental subjection, the community would be delimited by the fees which every faithful had to pay to his or her church. If such church was under the jurisdiction of one bishop, the faithful was automatically under his jurisdiction because part of his fees went to such bishop. The tenth part of all income a faithful had to donate for the church, the church's needs, became over a 9th century the new formal and juridical reference to solve the juridical controversies. This sort of recomposition, we could speak of a down-up configuration of this process, was sponsored by the secular authority. In particular, the experience of the so-called Ottonian imperial church, the so-called Reichskirche, and its effect on the episcopal selection determined new form, more stable, of contacts. They were, though, not only personally characterized. The aspect of the personal relationship between the bishop and his clergy and people resisted only because it shaped concretely in the form of an oath or a fee. The rituals and the juridical transpositions typical of a personal relationship lost their momentaneous and transitory value and assumed a new meaning. The rituals gathered the church and the other dealer. In other words, the network each bishop built did not disappear once he died, but it was integrated in the larger system of the diocesan network. This process was possible because of the political engagement to the political world. The bishops, as political leaders, needed sources, incomes, and knights for their fights and claims. To reach these goals, they sought new forms for a regular administration of the patrimony, a stable and strict control over the financial incomes, a social basis as larger as possible. The new needs determined the process of evolution of the diocesan organization. The personal ties became structural ties. The Episcopal Church overcame its own charismatic and urban conception and moved on to a new dimension, that of the Beamtenapparat, an institution made by defined offices. The Christian faithful were all members of the same community, but with different positions. The ecclesiastics lead the others, hence they were superior to all the others. The paradigm was elaborated by the intelligentsia of the ecclesiastical reform. A famous declaration was that of Adalberon of Laon, the author of the Carmen ad Robertum Regem, where he drew the tripartite feudal society according to the pattern oratores, bellatores, laboratores. This leadership was not only spiritual or charismatic, but had a physical match in the ever bigger enlargement of what was the church and what was the societas Christiana, the Christian society. The term societas, in fact, assumed a new extended meaning. It coincided with the entire Christian community. This community was led by the church, that was the ecclesiastical hierarchy, with all its ramification inside the rest of the society. The right image of this conception is that of a tree. God is the roots of the tree, the church is its trunk and branches, and the laymen are the leaves. The leaves get their life from the tree, but they cannot change it. If we wanted to represent this gambled social space, we will draw it like a constellation. We can see it like a wall, and we can imagine the connection between the different points, though we did not know which are the real distances between the points, the features of each point, the mechanism of the relations between all the points or part of them. Out of a metaphor, from the Reform period, the social space relative to the diocese became harder to read and draw because the society was changing and what had been a solid tradition was abandoned for other innovative solution. The Christian community as a unified body split in a, by and large, ordered constellation of people, interests, needs, and claims. And now, and in conclusion, from the 11th century, the ecclesiastics were regulating their presence through a new set of juridical tools, like the concept of res sacra, sacred thing. In the contrast with the other member of the societas, new forms of thinking, the administration, new practices, for example, the introduction of specific instruments or charges, new models for conceptualizing the clergy towards the layman. All these aspects were part of the process that Florian Mazel named Fabrique de la Diocèse, the factory of the diocese. It was a long period process made of the definition of the territory where a church was active. However, this phenomenon had no relevance on the virtual social space of the Latin Church. Only 2 centuries later, the Devotio Moderna and the breaking into the religious sphere by the layman would have forced the ecclesiastical body and its various articulation to explore new methods and new words to draw the new conformation of the ecclesiastical social space and the effects it would have had on its institutions. And we can consider, for example, Girolamo Savonarola or Martin Luther, 2 of the protagonists of that period. But my time is now finished, and I stop here. I hope you can follow me this long path on the edge of the history and the sociology. Many thanks for your patience and for your kind attention.